My name is Lubomír Zaorálek. I am the chairman of Masaryk Democracy Academy. I would like to welcome you all here in Prague and on this conference. I have this many distinguished guests and colleagues from also Baltic states, Balkan and Central East European countries. I am glad that we have possibility, platform to discuss the topics, especially on this platform of this Central East European territory, because sometimes I have a feeling that there is a tendency to some kind of isolationism in our countries and tendency to create in the midst of these energy crunches and crises individual packages. But I'm afraid that there is no chance to manage this situation individually. That is really deep need to talk to each other. And that is a must to find, collaborate on common solution. That's why I am glad that we have opportunity to address this topic connected with the current crisis of energy and tests which we have because of Russia invasion in Ukraine, and that we have this auditorium composed from members, representative of these different countries. Thank you for coming, and I wish you pleasant stay here and also interesting and fruitful debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lubomír. I'm David Rinaldi, instead, Director of Studies and Policies at FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, one of the organizing organizations for today. And this is the first public session of our Call to Europe event, which comes with a very ambitious objective. You can see it on the big banner there, addressing the crisis, costs, COVID-19, climate, and conflict. I personally doubt that we are very ambitious always, but I personally doubt we will solve all the crises in one afternoon. But at least we would like to highlight, if you want, some of the potential ways forward. And it's not by chance that this first panel actually is looking at welfare policies as not only a way in which we can secure protection to citizens in difficult times, but we can also strategize on the welfares to empower people, to create possibilities, and being more and more able to see welfare as a driver of the type of economic development that we want. The other aspect that we attach to the word welfare in this panel, in this first discussion, is the European dimension of it. So the fact that, of course, welfare is and will remain a national competence for many things, but we need to have somehow agreements, cooperation, guidelines, standards, and even financing from the European Union in order to make the best of our cooperation also in the field of social policies. I am particularly happy because in front of you we do an official presentation of the book Europe's Social Integration, Welfare Models and Economic Transformation by former European Commissioner on Employment László Andor, that happens also to be the Secretary General of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, and he's my direct boss, so I might not be completely how can I say, unbiased, but I think it's a judgment that László, everybody that I have met has on you, even when you are not in the room. So that speaks the truth about what people think. That you are one of these person that is able to always push the bar high and motivating the people around you with somehow vision for what social and economic coordination at the European Union level and at national level can mean. You are a constant driver for radical thinking as well, radical in the sense of being impactful. You have been one of the person in the machine when you served as commissioner at the European Union, but you are also a thinker besides being a policy maker. We are very happy to hear some distilled knowledge from your book. At the same time, I'm very happy to have with us Lubomír Zaorálek. You just took the floor, and not only in the capacity of president of the Masaryk Democracy Academy, but he's also, you know, with your expertise as a former minister, you have been able to touch both European and social affairs. Instead, to my left, I am happy to introduce you to Cecilia Bruzelius, professor of European Public Policy at Tübingen University. And she is actually a Swedish that is living and teaching and working in Germany. And instead to her, close to her, instead there's a German that is living in Brussels instead. And we have Matthias Ecke, member of the European Parliament from Germany, so from the SPD delegation, and we will discuss with them some of the implication on László's book. But it's not longer my time to speak. László, I'm happy to give you the floor. Perhaps you can reach the podium, and you can actually start with placing welfare at the core of the way in which we address the crisis, to kick off this intellectual contribution of Call to Europe on behalf of the Masaryk Academy, FEPS, and the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung that are today gathering forces here in Brussels to reflect on what is the Europe we want. What is the Europe you want?
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. It is really an honor that this Call to Europe event in Prague begins with a discussion about the book I published, thanks to FEPS, but also the London Publishing Partnership. But I think that the title of the book and the content as well connects very well with the agenda today. If you read this long title, and especially the subtitle, Cost, COVID-19, Climate and Conflict, at least for the first two, a further social integration of the European Union is absolutely vital. And this community, which is for the time being 27 countries, maybe it's going to be more in the future, they can only be stronger together if they also strengthen the social dimension of the economic integration. So that's how I would like to start with an interpretation of the title itself. I think those who start their studies about the European Union, they learn a lot about why and how it has been an economic integration. At the same time, for many of us, especially on the progressive side of politics, it has been equally important to ensure that this economic integration has a strong social dimension. Now, since when and how this concept has been developing? Those who have time to read the book will discover that I take back this idea to the early 1990s, when the European community was turned into a union and the four freedoms were created with the establishment of the so-called single market. And why this provided a big impetus to social integration? Because of the fear that enhanced economic competition would tend to undermine social standards in various countries. What social standards? Good and well-developed industrial relations, strong social safety nets, decent wages, decent working conditions, altogether what has been described as a European social model. The attachment to a European social model is absolutely central in this history of a few decades. The so-called European social model was not invented or introduced by the European Union as such. Nevertheless, there is an expectation that, first of all, the European Union should not threaten this European social model. And secondly, if there is a possibility, it should further strengthen instead of undermining the European social model. Now, this has been a very, very difficult task. I think if the history of the last 30 years shows something, that this is not an obvious task. It's an obvious and understandable expectation from the citizens, from the working people especially, but it's not so easy when you want to establish a monetary union, when you want to engage in a globalized competition and not only an economic integration in a continent, when you want to enlarge this economic integration to a much broader geography, and also when you want to push forward technological change. And in this book, I deal with these four chapters, four stories, because it's very often presented in a way that globalization, the monetary union, the Eastern enlargement, and the digitalization and robot revolution are actually threats and not opportunities from the point of view of social development. Why is this? It's not so difficult to explain in a nutshell. I think the social science literature is really rich with an assessment of globalization, especially a neoliberal globalization, as a tendency which takes away large numbers of industrial jobs from Europe, undermining the middle income categories and fostering income inequality, but also a trend that facilitates the export of savings to various tax havens and undermining the fiscal base of the welfare states in the most advanced countries. It also generates a kind of social dumping that distant countries with low wages, weaker social security systems become more attractive for investment. So it holds back at least quality investment and economic growth in much of the formerly industrialized parts of Europe. And then a lot of people have assessed the Eastern enlargement through the same lens, meaning that the Eastern enlargement actually internalized these tendencies of globalization. So in the last 15 years, when in Brussels and various EU institutions there was talk about social dumping, it was not about globalization anymore, but the East-West imbalance in the European Union, and famous discussions in EU legislation, like the one on posted workers, for example, have been revolving around this problem of social dumping and basically polarized, if not antagonized, West European countries from some of the East European countries, especially Poland and Hungary. So the crisis of the monetary union also exposed that somehow this original design of the EU, which goes back to the early 1990s, was not complete. It was full of various contradictions. Czechia doesn't directly experience the contradictions of the monetary union, being a country still using its own currency. But those inside the Eurozone have had this longer experience with a monetary union which introduces a single currency, but without common financial sector regulation, common fiscal safety nets, and various tools of solidarity, which would be necessary to prevent a deep crisis, but if they happen, to treat a critical situation very, very quickly and in a timely fashion. And even if 10 years ago we went through the experience of a financial crisis turning into an economic crisis, turning into a social crisis, paving the way to a political crisis in Europe, in the last 10 years, very little has been done in order to correct this model. At the same time, a lot of thinking took place about how it could be done. Now, what I would nevertheless highlight that this story is not so much doom and gloom. If you look at the literature about social Europe for a very long time in the past about 20 years, especially at the time of the Eurozone crisis, this was a literature about the lost paradise. There was a European social model, but it is not anymore with us, sadly, because of A, B, C, D reasons: austerity, digitalization, and you name it. At the same time, what I would like to highlight indeed is that perhaps in the last 5 years we experienced a turning point. The recent weeks saw a lot of commemoration of the establishment of the so-called European Pillar of Social Rights, which took place 5 years ago in November 2017. And last year, which was still a pandemic year, the European Commission and the whole set of institutions went after this social pillar with an action plan. Why is this important? It's important because it shows that two positive, so-called energizing shocks also occurred. One was Brexit, because the Brexit withdrew from this community the country which was the most reluctant in terms of social integration, and allowed the dominance of a social market model to prevail much more than it would have been the case with the UK continuing to play a skeptical role. And the other energizing shock is COVID-19 itself, which was perceived completely differently than the financial crisis 10 years before. The financial crisis was perceived as a polarizing crisis with countries managing themselves well on the one hand and countries mismanaging on the other side. I'm simplifying a little bit. On the other hand, COVID-19 has been seen as a symmetrical shock. And it very quickly generated a large amount of solidarity between countries, but also within countries. The EU was allowed to come forward with new instruments, much stronger financial capacity than before, and also instruments that can directly help job-saving schemes within the member states. The EU couldn't stop with a new policy that also went after the question of inadequate minimum wages. And Czechia, but also all countries east and south of Czechia, should also see this as a very beneficial trend, because the east-west imbalance in terms of wage dynamics would be strongly helped. And maybe it was counterintuitive, but the EU still maintained this on the agenda at the time of the pandemic, and even made it as a kind of flagship policy of a new chapter in social integration. I would imagine that Commissioner Nicolas Schmit, who will join us later today, will tell you more in concrete terms about this development. So it's not only that it is not a story of doom and gloom, but indeed there's been a new chapter opened. At the same time, various social scientists and policy wonks are talking about going even further and introducing a so-called social union, which in my view is an absolutely legitimate discussion. You have to put it into the context of the reforms of the last 10 years, which started in 2012 with the idea of a banking union, promoted the concept of a fiscal union, but also in the meantime we have seen an energy union a security union, and so on and so forth, I think there is absolutely no reason to abandon the concept of a social union, which would contribute massively not only to an economic cohesion and competitiveness, but also to the legitimacy of the European Union in the eyes of the citizens in diversity of countries. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, László. Dear gentlemen, I would love to give the floor first to Professor Bruzelius, Cecilia, if I may, largely because you might have, I would say, an academic viewpoint, and then perhaps we go with the more political analysis and feedback. Maybe your comments and your input or responses to László's described path of social policy integration, and he mentioned also the difficulties between East and West, and I would like to see, even if on wages or mobility, there are issues there that you can contribute to, and perhaps even the other point of, the last point that László stressed, the social union. How can we put some real bite on that?
Okay, first, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a bit of a daunting task to comment on a book that says give you the full picture of a social union, but I recommend those who want to get the complete summary to read it. It's great. I will use it for teaching. So I want to first pick up on the more specific topic on labor mobility in the European Union, which, as László was saying, has been an area of contention, mainly from the perspective of what countries of destination view as problematic, so social dumping, the rights of so-called poor migrants, etc. One interesting development there has been the European Labour Authority that has been established, which is meant to coordinate enforcement across European member states. This is symbolically very important, but I think also primarily symbolic, because they have very limited staff, 150 persons, and what do we have? Some 300 million workers, a little bit less in the European Union, and national enforcement institutions have very limited capacities. But that is an interesting development. Now, what I would like to focus more on, and what László brings up in his book, is the impact on countries of origin. So the countries that have had high out-migration. It's especially a number of countries in Central Eastern Europe, so Croatia, the Baltics, Romania. And this is something that I think has been way too little discussed at European level. It's a sensitive issue, but a very important one. And the question is, what will be long-term consequences of this for convergence? In the book is described how we've seen a growth without an improvement of welfare policy in many Central Eastern European countries. What will that mean, even if we have wage convergence but no improvement of welfare for future patterns of migration? What will it mean for socioeconomic policy that we, for example, now see a number of member states that have had high out-migration reverting to immigration from non-EU countries, so high labor immigration? Is that going to be a way to, for example, keep wages down in some sectors and sort of low wage competition, so cementing divergence? Yeah? But a more positive note would be, could these realization that we need these people be an incentive to actually invest in welfare? I've seen this in, at least on paper, a number of member states saying, okay, we better improve our social services to keep some of the young people here. So these are open questions. And a bigger political question for the EU is a question of redistribution. So we think always of the net contributor and the net recipient countries in terms of the cohesion funds, but should we also think about what it means that the education of people who leave from one place and go to another is actually a form of redistribution of resources from the countries that made the investment and the countries where they then work and contribute through taxes. And then I would like to open a bigger and more abstract discussion, but I think it's an important one. And that is to do with the last social union, the giving Europe, the EU, more responsibilities, competencies in the social area. For example, often discussed as an unemployment insurance. This is typically done with references to the functional necessity of Europe, the EU being involved in the social sphere, in social policy. And that's good and fine, but I think it's not enough. So if we refer always to functional necessities and using social policy as a stabilization, to stabilize and to counter economic and social risks, we miss the fact that social policy is not, it's not a neutral concept. It's not somehow always something good. It can be used against the interest of citizens. It can be used coercively and in ways that certainly don't fit with, something like common shared European values. And I think the description of Hungary in this book is one example of how social policy can be pursued. So my bigger question is, do we want the EU to support any kind of social policy? And if we don't, or I should add, not just do we want that, but also could we actually even achieve something such as political agreement to have further EU competencies if we only refer to functional necessities? I think that we need to have more of a discussion that what we actually what we understand by social. What is a sort of lowest common denominator of what we think a social state should do? So one thing I wonder is if it shouldn't be about ensuring a social minimum for all. And whatever that is that we agree the social state should do, I think EU should have a stronger role in that. And the question is then, how should that look? And I will leave that to the politicians. If I may add one sentence, it would be war, right? What's the role of war? We had the COVID crisis, now we have another crisis. And in the short term, countries are redirecting resources to spending on defense. But could it be, thinking of it more positively, that in the long term, this will contribute to a shared sense of community and more willingness for these sorts of European measures, even, in the otherwise so reluctant Nordic countries that now suddenly want to join NATO, etc. So, thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. I still look to my left, Matthias Ecke, member of the European Parliament. The question is rather big. What does it mean to have a social union? Can we ensure minimum quality standards for all? Is that the role that you also see from Europe? And perhaps also from your side, something on the way to close and end with these tensions between somehow East and West, if somehow a European welfare or a European prominent social policy can help us to get to be more united in a sense.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you also to FEBS for inviting me here to Prague, which just a small correction. I'm not really living in Brussels, but in Dresden, and I happen to be in Brussels from time to time, and so which is something like a neighboring city in the east of Germany, a neighboring city to Prague, only 2 hours travel. And we also share a border, and we also share a lot of we have a lot of things in common when it comes to transformation from a planned economy to a social market economy. So this is also the perspective from which I see a lot of challenges on social Europe. And to get the bigger picture, I think that on the one hand, there is, of course, a functional argument, as Cecilia mentioned. Of course, we need to have a cohesion policy, we need to have a redistributive policy to keep the internal market together. But I think that's not the normative course that we are talking about. The other dimension is that we, of course, especially on the progressive side, have a normative incentive to have a more social Europe, to provide European citizens with an established social rights, and the European Union has a role in ensuring it. That means, on the one hand, of course, we need minimum standards on labor rights, on social rights, on also on rights concerning family roles and so on. But on the other hand, Europe should also help national states to deliver on their national compromises on social welfare, which means that in the past we had which is also, László, in your book very well described, that we had the European Union contributing to a sort of race to the bottom between the member states and their relative social compromises. And we had this kind of social standards limited, wages went down or they didn't rise. And because it was a sort of an internal devaluation in times of a common currency. So the European Union's first task is to not make matters worse in national states. That's the first thing to do. And the second one, of course, is to make things better. And that also, that means legislation on the one hand. But let me come back to the question of funding. The cohesion policy, that's something that I'm dealing with in the European Parliament, is an excellent tool to mitigate the regional inequalities. Because not only between national states, but also between regions, we have a tremendous inequality in Europe. And the problem is that all these developments that that are mentioned in the name of today's conference, but also are well explained in your book, László, is these crises contribute to deepen regional inequalities, and even making matters worse. Also, the long-term developments that can be really called a crisis, like rather transformations, a digital transformation or a transformation to a more climate-neutral economy, they also tend to have a deepening effect on inequalities. So this is something that we have to react to in our European toolbox when it comes to cohesion and when it comes to other funding, which on the one hand means that we need to attribute enough resources to the task of cohesion, because we have, of course, I mean, we have a debate, we have a struggle in the European Parliament, in the Council, on what to spend the limited amount of European funds on. We have cohesion policy on the one hand, but we also have like sectoral programs on the other hand. And now we have the positive and very helpful example of Next Generation EU, of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which adds a huge amount of money for only a temporary time frame on the regular EU budget. So we lift like EU budget from 1% GDP to like 1.8%, but only for a limited time. But it is not done under a cohesion imperative. It is just Brussels is distributing the money to the national capitals, and the nation states, they spend it on projects, on priorities that were set European-wide, but the regions and also social partners are not involved. So this is a precedent which is helpful in terms of allocating the money, because we have a common borrowing spent on European priorities, but it's a bad precedent in terms of governance, because it brings classical cohesion policy in a more defensive position. So we have to debate on how we can limit, mitigate, or even lessen the regional disparities we have. We need to spend more money on it, and we also need to fix our priorities, because it is not only about catching up. It is not only about imitating successful models of production of former decades. So if you only, imitate and try to copy those that were on the front, then you will always be number two. It's also a question, how can those regions that are not on the top of the wealth pyramid in Europe, how can they invest their resources cleverly with the help of the European Union to be on the forefront in the next innovation cycle? We have now a we are heading towards a climate neutral economy. We are heading to e-mobility, hydrogen economy, more digital services, you name it. And there's a new game. a new distribution also of advantages and disadvantages. And we have to be very smart in investing our money so that those regions that are in the catch-up process can be in the lead and can have an advantage with a new economic cycles in the future.
Thanks, Mr. Ecke. Thanks, Matthias. I now look at Mr. Zaorálek, dear Lubomír. It's up to you somehow to contextualize this big discussion also in terms of politics here in the Czech Republic. What is your viewpoint on the type of social Europe that Czech may want?
Yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that I wanna recommend this László Andor's book to anybody. This book, Europe is Social Integration. I am convinced it is an excellent book, and social policy in this book represent very dramatic story, and because I am interested more in foreign policy issues, but it was exciting for me to see this development of European integration in Europe, especially from this point of view, social policy. And I would like to say that I said it is a very dramatic story. On the end, I was a little bit horrified. I would like to explain why. Because all the time, you have to understand from the point of view of Czech Republic, or country which entered to EU in 2004, our entrance was associated with an idea of incremental convergence of the whole eastern flank. And I was also convinced that it's not only interest of Czech Republic, but it was everyone's interest, yes, to manage this process of convergence. It's connected with this cohesion funds that I am very close to my predecessors. That's why I said that I would like to explain why this book represents so dramatic story. On the beginning, we have Karl Polanyi in his great transformation, and the thesis that to a certain degree, social policy was a precondition for the development of capitalist economy and society. And faith in self-regulating market is nonsense. We have to enhance the role of the state and so. And now, the second step, monetary union was established without unified financial supervision and common fiscal capacity. It is something like to build a house without a roof, which could be destroyed during the first storm. Yes, you see how dramatic it is, this development. We have monetary union now, and in this book you can find the sentence of László said, convergence within the EU has ceased. You said it's stopped. Because of why? Because of monetary union, the communities was split into two groups of countries. One, thanks to the high level of welfare state, was able to survive, and the other welfare state depends on the fluctuation of boom and bust. Yeah, as László is saying. It cannot be counterbalanced by means of social policy alone, because what is needed is a comprehensive rethinking of the structure and operation of monetary union. I know this book of Joseph Stiglitz, which was in 2015. Maybe it was when Stiglitz is saying that sweeping reforms are needed. Is Stiglitz saying in this book? Because Maastricht model failed to take into account that the monetary union would have an even stronger polarizing impact than the single market. Yes, the monetary union means polarization. Yes, it means that polarization that reveals the EU diversity, the social and cultural differences. It means there is nothing to help you to converge, maybe to solve the problem of disadvantages, reason, and so. That's the most important distinction is between the center and the periphery. You understand what I mean? We entered in 2004, and there is a danger to be on the. If there will be no convergence and will be no functioning cohesion funds, there is a danger to be on the periphery, because this system is stabilizing periphery and the center. There is nothing to help to overcome these divisions. And that I can cite Klaus Offet, 2015, EU has fallen into a trap. We were not able to, in the system, we were not able to build common fiscal capacity to stabilize economic cycle. Now, I'm not speaking about convergence. It seems to me it's something different. The one thing is to stabilize economic cycle, but EU was not able to elaborate some mechanisms to stabilize this economic center because they were not able to develop fiscal capacity in the Eurozone in needed size. In 2021, 27, it was some draft budget published in May 2018, initiated the creation of fiscal capacity for the Eurozone, but the size is insignificant. It's only symbolic step. László is writing about homeopathic, it seems to me, homeopathic form. It's that we have no transfer system able to create stabilization fund, because if you want to solve these disparities, you need something like stabilization fund. But if you have no transfer system, no agreement between, I don't know, different parts of the EU, that we are not able to create anything, we have no fiscal capacity. There is one important event, it is COVID. During COVID, something happened. Maybe somebody could say there was a revolution, because during COVID, we were able to create this, we were really able to create new type of fiscal capacity emerged during COVID. Cross-border transfer, first time in history, started to implement from borrowed resources, will be repaid by 2058. That we borrowed money during COVID and created this, how to say it, recovery and resilient facility. New next generation EU, or it was part of multinational financial framework. For us in government, it was important, this recovery and resilient facility. It represents 310 billion euro in grants and 250 billion euro in loans. Something unbelievable. First time in history, we were able to create this system of transfers because of Germany, and because Germany changed mind and also convinced countries like Netherlands, Denmark, Finland, Austria, and others, these frugal states, to change that we have to accept this package, which will help us to renovate, to overcome the impacts of COVID. But I would like to stress that this revolutionary step is only counter-cyclical. It's for me, it is only counter-cyclical policy. It's only terminal. As I said, it is one package of money which should be repaid by 2058. And my feeling is that we are partly solving this problem of economical cycle, but where is the problem of convergence? Because I'm convinced all the time we have no instrument to solve something which seems to me fundamental, not only for us, our expectations that after entry to EU, it will be this step-by-step convergence between East and the West, but also because I'm also convinced that there is a prerequisite for the successful integration of European Union to be able to converge, not to only to reproduce this system of unbalances, which is dangerous for the future. And the question is how, because I understand from this book that this convergence and this cohesion policy is repeatedly sidelined. It was said that in Juncker's commission, this cohesion policy was occupied a defense position from the outset, because in Juncker's commission it was repeated that we need money for migration, for external affairs. And I can ask how it will look like now. Now we need money in Czech Republic for defense, a billion of crown for defense. It was pledged, was promised that we already, maybe we will have defense union in Europe, because EU is connected with lobbyism in a very strong way. I can imagine that we can have we can strengthening health union, we can have defense union, maybe we can push towards banking union and capital market union, because all these branches represent very strong lobbyists also, which are able to push this. But I'm asking how it will look like with the convergence policy and cohesion funds, because we saw that in the, I know that you agree, that the cohesion policy was sidelined. Maybe that's why we have the group of friends of cohesion to protect this tendency. But and there is unwillingness really to devote energy and money to cohesion policy. And I am afraid that it's something which is endangering not only Czech Republic and Central East European countries, but probably it is endangering the whole process of integration. If our main goal is to keep Europe together, then I'm afraid it will be not able to solve this problem connected with the social policy. Then that we will face the danger of disintegration of European Union. Am I right that the result could be the disintegration? And what do we see now? Now, what we say, we have German package subsidies for industry, we have United States, United are not a part of, but United package of subsidies for industry. Maybe is there any chance to create something which could return us to this idea of convergence, cohesion policy? Or is it only illusion? That's why it's a fascinating book, but on the end, I'm a little bit uncertain how realistic is to return to this idea that after entry to European Union, we can expect this incremental convergence of eastern flank to west, or we will be only in waiting room all the time?
Thanks a lot. Before going back to László, that you owe a response to what you have heard, I would like to give another 45 seconds each to the panel for one actually look at the future. Because it's true that we have seen a gloomy and a bad picture of an unfinished house in the European Union. We have bricks, we built some walls, but some of the core infrastructures have not been constructed. But if I look at the last decade and I look what the current Commission, particularly with Commissioner Schmidt that will join us later on, have been able to do. I look at some, step forward in minimum standards on parental leave, the child union, adequate and minimum wages directive, some measures on work-life balance, other measures on the care, not only the care economy, but the European care strategy. For instance, so there are a plethora of initiatives, including an action plan for the European Pillar of Social Rights with a skills agenda. Somehow there is a lot of points in the core agenda of social policies. What do you want from the next Commission? What is the next fight that could inspire progressive action? somehow. What do you stand ready to advocate for and to campaign for? Matthias, can I go to you first?
Which I would like to be have from the next commission is that it would be led by a social democrat. To be honest, that will solve a lot of problems, I think, because on the despite all the efforts you rightfully mentioned, on the head of the commission with von der Leyen, there's actually she's not so much enthusiastic about social policy. It's not a matter of importance to her. It's all the social democratic commissioners that push for it, and of course our group in the EP and also our member state. But the next phase would be, on the one hand, that we should be more assertive on the legislation that you outlined. Some of it I won't repeat it, but we are already on a good track, but we need minimum regulations also on social insurance, I would say, and also on social assistance. And we need to strengthen workers' rights and social bargaining. But on the other hand, we also need a more competitive central budget of the European Union, because we already spoke about the need of a fiscal capacity, like a real one that has a real macroeconomic impact in asymmetrical shocks. There is talks in the parliament to create a permanent fiscal capacity that is worth its name. And okay, some might call it, the right wing would rather call it like permanent exceptional measure or something, because they don't want to call something a permanent fiscal capacity. But we have the precedent of NGEU now, and there's a need for a bigger, more competitive budget to face all the challenges that we have. This is the one point. And then I also think that we need to work on the own resources of the European Union, because we can't always take the money from the member states and transfer it to Brussels, because we all face the same challenges, and we have possible ways of creating own resources for the European Union as a joint supranational body, and we need to use them. And I think that we are on a good track, and the next Commission should work on that as well.
Thanks. What I retake is the budget of a real federal union. Thanks, Cecilia.
That was more than 45 seconds. I will maybe say something different that we didn't talk about. I'll be short. No, it's great with the directive this and minima this, or recommendation that. One big sort of elephant in the room is enforcement. Also, cohesion funds is great with cohesion funds, whether they're, I think you said, excellent tools to tackle inequalities, depend also on how they're spent. And here it's often a very weak, uncomfortable area of this. I would have liked to see more than a recommendation on minimum income benefits. I think this is a very important area of policy, and not least, the discussion today with cost of living crisis. And as to the very, big question, as a virtue of someone who does research and thinks always about the big picture, I will repeat the point I made about war, that, maybe some decades down the line, we will see what this brought in terms of the two crises, COVID and now the outer threat of the enemy, and being not just a virus, but another big country, what that will bring in terms of European Union, and maybe more capacity to find agreement on politically difficult issues such as social policy and common budget or EU budget.
Lubomír, 45 seconds to you, and then 4 minutes max to László to respond.
It is the same, what is in Czech Republic is the same situation in Europe. I remember when during COVID this was created, this recovery and resilient facility fund and package, then this frugal state promised voters that in the future no similar recovery fund should be created again. That why maybe, but that seems to make clear that we have to change fundamentally budget. And I don't know how much, if today we have, I don't know, 2% of GDP, that it should be, I don't know, 7, 8, I don't know precisely. But it means that if we could speak, if we could speak about convergence and cohesion funds, it's impossible without fundamental change in this way. That's it, because, as I said, all these instruments are only terminal. And if we want to keep this process integration, we need this fundamental change and to increase the role of the budget of European Union. It's my conviction.
Thank you. László?
Well, first of all, I should thank the panelists and David for this gentle discussion about the book and its content. I learned a lot about how it can be interpreted. I would like to pick one topics from each panelist, because it all has been really fascinating. From Lubomír, indeed, we have a fascination on the EU funds. And since we are at the end of the discussion and not at the start, I would just like to highlight something which is important regarding the history of these funds. It is that with every important milestone of the evolution of the integration, a new major fund was created. At the very start, it was basically due to Italy that the European Social Fund was created in the late 50s. And then in the 70s, it was basically because of Great Britain that the Regional Fund was created. And then in the 1990s, it was basically because of Spain that the Cohesion Fund was created. Now, at the time of the Eastern enlargement, no new fund was created, which in my view demonstrates the lack of recognition of specific challenges in economic and social development regarding the eastern flank of the new member states. So this, I think, gives us a lot of food for thought. Why this deficit has occurred? Is there no volumes missing? Why, until now, the EU only tried to address this lack of funds through what we call financial engineering, right? Trying to mix grants with loans, new schemes based on the European Investment Bank, and you name it. And is this experience of the last 15 years, providing sufficient analysis for launching some new initiative to reconsider the EU budget, how it functions, what cohesion means, and how to serve it? Matthias, I would like to highlight something very important you pointed out about the role of inequality. Because of my experience and Vladimir Špidla's experience, if I can also go back to his time, to bring attention to poverty, material deprivation, and develop a very sophisticated method to analyze all this and link it with policy. But we always had to stop before going into inequality, because it requires a different type of political commitment. I think it could be a topic of a next discussion, whether we have sufficient political ammunition to bring inequality to the center of the discussion, because that would change the game, in my view, very, very significantly. Because it's sometimes easy to bring all stakeholders to a common denominator regarding poverty reduction. Now the EU came back last year in the action plan again with a commitment to poverty reduction. And as compared to that, I think looking at inequality would be absolutely justified, but it requires a different level of political commitment. Cecilia twice was asking about the war, and probably this is also something we should look at, just to avoid that the conclusion is too negative. Because it's true that even if the war basically means destruction of human lives, infrastructure, productive capacities, and it's very difficult to look for a silver lining. But it's true that there are many cases when a war indeed triggered new commitment to solidarity within countries, with people who need humanitarian assistance and various type of support. And for example, at the end of World War II, the United States arrived to what they call the GI Act to allow people who participated in the army and came from a social background which otherwise would not have allowed them to go to university to enter higher education. So there is always some possibility to move to a next stage as long as there is solidarity and imagination and an understanding of what is the specificity of the current crisis as compared to the previous one. In the previous crisis, which was the COVID-19, the EU was justified to roll out the short instrument to support the Kurzarbeit schemes in member states. Why? Because the Kurzarbeit is a very good solution if you need to bridge a short period. And you assume that after 1 year, maybe 2 years, the market will bounce back. Now it's not going to bounce back. We have a structural change. Kurzarbeit schemes are less useful than before. I think this is the time for universal basic services, unemployment reinsurance at the European Union level, because we need a different kind of approach to this crisis than to the previous ones. Thank you so much.